Chrysanta tapped her pencil's eraser on the desk once, then again, before circling the answer to the last question. That had been the hardest on the quiz, pretty much the only one that required more than just a cursory skimming of the section of the textbook they'd been assigned to read. Mr. Matson was losing his touch, or finally accepting that most of his students didn't really care about the class. She quickly looked over the questions again, making sure that the teacher hadn't done something tricky with the phrasing in any of them. As far as she could tell, he hadn't, so she flipped the paper over and leaned back in her chair, glancing around the room without making it look like she was searching for answers in someone else's work. A surge of pride hit her when she saw that, apparently, she was the first one done. Everyone else was hunched over their desks in concentration, some mumbling to themselves, some chewing nervously on their pencils. Back in elementary school, her teachers would always tell her, "It isn't a race," but, of course, that wasn't actually true. They just couldn't let all the other kids feel bad when she beat them so badly. And, back then, Kalina was usually right behind her. Sometimes they would tie, but most of the time, her sister was just the tiniest bit slower. Now. Chrysanta turned her head towards Kalina's chair, where her sister was obviously still at work. Chrysanta could see her feet twisted back into the book rack under the seat, knees bouncing with what was either nerves or an overload of sugar, and, considering she was chewing on her bottom lip as well, the former was more likely. She found herself smiling cruelly at her sister's predicament for some reason she couldn't quite fathom, though it made her feel a bit dirty once she'd managed to stop. What was wrong with her, that she got some kind of satisfaction from seeing Kalina squirm? There was a time when seeing that would have made her feel a little sick to her stomach, make her want to do anything to help. As it turned out, however, Kalina was about to do that for herself. She raised her eyes towards the front of the class, apparently checking to make sure that the teacher's gaze was occupied elsewhere, then turned sideways, leaning out over the aisle to sneak a glance at the test on the desk of the inattentive boy next to her. Chrysanta heard herself gasp, felt her cheeks grow red as the people around her gave her odd looks. Kalina gave her one of those as well, after hastily resituating herself in her chair and scribbling down the answers she'd just found. Chrysanta knew she should say something to Mr. Matson, no matter how unpopular that made her with Kalina, but as she shuffled past his desk at the end of class, all she could bring herself to do was set the quiz down on the top of the growing pile and stop for long enough to get him to notice her. Yes. He might have sounded annoyed, but it was hard to tell, because, as far as she could tell, he always sounded somewhat like that. She meant to open her mouth, ready to do the right thing, but she couldn't even get that far, as all of her muscles seemed to tense up, starting with those in her jaw. She shook her head stiffly and skittered out of the classroom, not even bothering to put on her backpack. She could still spot Kalina in the hall, walking and talking with one of her weird friends. "Kalina," she called, her body allowing her to speak again, as her plan changed to convincing her sister to confess rather than tattling. Perhaps Mr. Matson would go easier on her that way. But she didn't hear, or was choosing to ignore her. Chrysanta started to push through the crowd before Kalina could vanish, only to bump straight into her art teacher, Miss Higgins. "Sorry, dear," the woman said, but by then it was too late. Chrysanta, surprised, accidentally let go of the backpack she still hadn't slung back over her shoulder, dropping it in the middle of the hall, papers scattering in every direction like a split-second blizzard. The girl's eyes shot up towards her door as her heart promptly froze. She sat there on the floor, legs splayed in front of her, for another few moments, until the knock came again. "Come on," the girl's sister hissed from the other side. "Stop acting like a baby and talk to me."